Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast.
This podcast episode originally aired on Dr. Frank Scalambrino's previous podcast, Basic Philosophical Questions.
This episode is intimately related to episode on the eternal return, so you may want to check it out first, as it will help add depth to the discussion of Amor Fati. However, this episode is an episode unto itself, so here we go. The overview of what we're going to be talking about then is I'm going to provide a general characterization of Amor Fati. Then we're going to look at what really is the essential statement of Amor Fati from the Joyful Quest, or Die Frohliche Wissenschaft, the gay science, as it's sometimes translated, or as the joyful science, as it has been most recently translated. We're then going to look at Amor Fati as the second part of a two-part idea in Nietzsche's philosophy. Of course, the eternal return is the first part of that two-part idea, and the previous episode was dedicated to a discussion of the eternal return. Also, I discussed this extensively. I discussed both the eternal return and Amor Fati in my book, Full Throttle Heart, The Rapture and Ecstasy of Nietzsche's Dionysian Worldview. So if you're interested, there's a link in the description that you could check out that book as well. Next, we're going to take a look at Nietzsche's statement of Amor Fati in other places. Specifically, we're going to look at his statement in Twilight of the Idols. We're going to look at his statement in Ecce Homo. We're going to look at his statement in The Will to Power. Lastly, then, we're going to look at Amor Fati as the culmination of a joyful quest. This is the idea in general that Amor Fati is a soteriological concept. This is the overview, but there's a lot more to say, so we'll go ahead and jump right in because there's a lot of ground to cover. All right. So in terms of a general characterization of Amor Fati, one of the first things I want to point out is just a quick comment regarding pronunciation. So, of course, anytime you're pronouncing these Latin terms, I'm not overly concerned with exactly how it's pronounced. I have heard it pronounced in many different ways, Amor Fati and so on, but Amor Fati is how it just sort of rolls off the tongue for me, so that's how I pronounce it. You can pronounce it any way that you like. Next, then, it seems to me that Amor Fati belongs in the category of soteriology. So if you got a chance to take a look at episode 1, we were looking at the architectonic of philosophy in general, and ultimately Amor Fati is a soteriological idea. The eternal return may be understood in multiple ways. It may be understood as fitting into multiple categories in the architectonic of philosophy, but really, Amor Fati belongs in the category of soteriology. So we'll see how this makes sense as we go forward. So a couple quick points here to make. There's an interesting link here to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. At the beginning of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he asks the question, can we consider any person happy before their life is over, right? If you are living a good life, you may think that you are happy, but there may be things in the future that are unpleasant for you or something like that. And so should we count your life happy, or should we just wait until your life is over and then look back on the whole of it? There is a sense in which we can look at Amor Fati, especially as the second part of a two-part idea, the first part being the eternal return, as a response to Aristotle there. So one of the ways in which we can understand that is this sense in which if we are living this life over and over again eternally, as in the eternal return, it's not possible to say, well, we're going to wait till the end of your life to look back and determine then whether you're happy or not. So really what we're getting at, and I don't think that this conclusion is completely foreign to Aristotle at all, actually, because I think what we're talking about is a kind of virtue, right? But what we're going to find with Amor Fati is that it really is a kind of attitude. And when I say attitude, I mean relation, right? So philosophically, attitude is another word for relation, in the sense that my attitude toward external reality, for example, or my attitude toward the different velts of the velt matrix, we might say, that attitude constitutes my relation to those velts, or my relation to whatever happens in my life. So this is a different way of characterizing happiness, as opposed to characterizing happiness as looking at the entirety of someone's life and then asking whether or not that was a happy life. As we're going to see very quickly, that with Amor Fati, even if life is tragic, we might say in terms of a kind of virtue, or in terms of a kind of soteriology, or in terms of a kind of happiness, that Amor Fati constitutes an attitude or relation that would be happy. We could say that a person has a happy life or lives a good life, even if that life is filled with tragedy. So just an interesting point to make in regard to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in essence, just dominates philosophical ethics in the West. So it's important to make this connection here. All right, one of the ways we can think about this also then is Amor Fati as a late modern retrieval of ancient Greek. You may like to hear the word pagan here. A late modern retrieval of ancient Greek pagan theodicy. And theodicy is the question of God's justice. Its etymology is made up of the Greek words theos and dike, God and justice. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I'm just announcing it here so that you can see that it is possible to understand Amor Fati with this notion of theodicy in the background. So one of the questions being that whereas other philosophers have looked at existence, and this is just like the point we just made about Aristotle, whereas other philosophers have looked at existence and have asked questions like, is life good? Is existence good? Is the life that God has given us, or is the life that we have been given, is this a good thing? Is it a good life? Is it fair? Is it just? And Nietzsche, just like in relation to Aristotle's question about a happy life, Nietzsche's Amor Fati is providing a very unique response to this theodicy-based question. So we'll see how that goes as we go further. But one of the ways that we can think about this, and I won't be able to go into this last comment here too much in this episode, because I really want to get to Amor Fati specifically, but the idea that a phenomenological experience, or the idea that the content of my life, the content of my experience, may be theological or may involve divinity, in the sense that my affectivity may be rooted in a relation to the gods. I think that this is important, especially this idea of Dionysus or Dionysus, if you like. This is why it's the subtitle of the Full Throttle Heart book, the second edition of the Full Throttle Heart book. And also, if you saw the episode on Nietzsche's canon, we talk there how the Dionysian Worldview was an original idea of Nietzsche's, and that it remains throughout the entirety of his writing career. All right, and then lastly, this idea of Amor Fati as the attitude of apotheosis. Nietzsche's explicit question in regard to the eternal return is, how do you respond? 2 points need to be made. On the one hand, he points out that it is a demon or a daimon that may be coming to you and saying this. So he is explicitly invoking the idea of divinity and the sense in which the idea of the eternal return may be given to us from a divine being, right? So I think that needs to be emphasized. But then the second piece here is the idea of the principle of selection. So, and again, Nietzsche is pretty explicit about this also in regard to the eternal return. And I think that Amor Fati is the height of the selective principle. There are a number of different ways in which you could respond to the eternal return, and how you respond to the eternal return reveals something about your character, it reveals something about the level of self-actualization that you have accomplished thus far. And so there is freedom involved here, because even if it's the case that your life is eternally recurring, there is some sense in which you have the freedom to either actualize or not actualize. You have the freedom to change your attitude. You do have control over your relation to this existence that may in fact be eternally repeating itself. Okay, so then if we think that there are a few different ways in which we could respond to the eternal return, the lowest of which would be to fall on the ground and gnash our teeth. The highest, then, relation that we could have to the eternal return is the relation of Amor Fati. So that's why, as we're going to see here in a moment, that's why Amor Fati is the second part of a two-part idea, and the first part is the eternal return. So if it's the case that Amor Fati is the attitude that indicates one has self-actualized or fully self-actualized when they are responding to the eternal return as a selective principle, then we could also say that Amor Fati is the attitude of apotheosis, in the sense that when we have accomplished self-actualization, when we have accomplished apotheosis, then the attitude that we have is the attitude of Amor Fati. So by way of an introduction, then, hopefully that's sufficient that we can say, all right, well then what is Amor Fati, right? What exactly does this mean? Clearly it is some sort of very high idea for Nietzsche. But I do just want to note that there are a number of mistakes that are being made in regard to Amor Fati in some of these other videos. And so I just want to clear them up here so that if you do come across these other videos and you hear these things, I want you to be able to know the correct way to understand them. The last two major bullet points then on this slide. So does saying yes to everything mean we must like or be pleased by everything? And the answer to that is no. So we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get looking at the actual passages in which Nietzsche states Amor Fati. If it were the case that saying yes to everything meant that we needed to be pleased by everything, then there is some sense in which it wouldn't really be much of an accomplishment. If everything that you experience is pleasurable, then it's not much of an accomplishment to say that you like it, right? So the idea here is that there will be things that occur, and Nietzsche is clearly emphasizing that there will be events in your life that occur that are unpleasant, that there will be tragedies. And Amor Fati is the idea that we have achieved a level of actualization that we are able to say yes even to these tragedies. All right, so that's one typical mistake that we see, and here's a couple others. Nietzsche is not a Stoic. I'm going to put together an episode on this later. Really, the only reason I'm putting an episode together on this later is because I find this so often. I find it on YouTube. I find it on Instagram. People want to equate Nietzsche with Stoicism. And Amor Fati is the idea, the central idea that they use to link Nietzsche to Stoicism. All right, so there are two reasons that I would say that we can differentiate Nietzsche's philosophy from Stoic philosophy. The first one is, if we just look at quotes from Nietzsche, Nietzsche is explicit. He is explicit in his criticisms of Stoic philosophy. I'm not going to touch on those here because it will go too far afield, but we will address these later, and I'll look at some of the passages in which Nietzsche criticizes Stoicism. The other idea being that Nietzsche's Amor Fati is not ascetic, right? So there is some sense in which, when we look at Stoicism, they advocate that we should not overly indulge in laughter, right? And that, of course, is very far from Nietzsche's philosophy. I think that Nietzsche's philosophy is very much one of embracing whatever it is that you are experiencing, and that includes the emotional content of that. It includes the affective content, your affects. It includes the feeling of these experiences. So even when it is a terrible experience, you can embrace that feeling, and almost in a sense, this is that which does not kill me makes me stronger. I don't think that in any way that is somehow glorifying trauma. I think that what it's really doing is it's honoring resilience, right? I think it's honoring resilience. What we're saying is something like, it is possible to embrace even the affect of tragedy, or the affect that we are experiencing as we go through a tragedy, in the sense that this is the life that has been given to us by the gods. And I think that this is, again, another way to link up with the eternal return. It's another way to link up with the Dionysian worldview. But the point here is that Nietzsche's Amor Fati is not ascetic. It is not renouncing experience or renouncing affectivity. And so as a result, these are the two ways that I would differentiate Nietzsche and his notion of Amor Fati from the Stoic idea. Lastly, then, this mistake is made in almost every video that I've seen on the internet. Does Amor Fati mean that everything is fated? And the answer here must be no. The answer here is it has to be no. So this is going to push us a little bit into questions of free will. I won't get too bogged down by this, but the idea is that, as we'll see in the statement, that Nietzsche wants us to embrace what is necessary. And it is not necessary that we embrace what is necessary. If it were necessary that we embrace what is necessary, then there would be no choice in the matter, and there would be no soteriology in the sense of an apotheosis. Rather, everything would just be fated. So one of the ways in which you could think about this is in terms of the eternal return, right? So if it's the case that everything is fated, which is what you hear quite often on the internet, if everything is fated, then your response to this divine being that is telling you that your life is going to eternally return, your response to that divine being would also be determined. Right? Your response to that divine being would also be fated. So then the idea is that it just nullifies the entire thought experiment. It nullifies the entire idea. There is no point in asking yourself the question, how would I respond to the eternal return, if it's the case that the way that I respond to the eternal return is the way that I'm always going to respond to the eternal return eternally, right? So again, we got to be clear that there must be some space for the will. There must be some space for choice. And Nietzsche is an existentialist. He's not a Stoic. So anyway, I just wanted to be clear on all of these things so that if you encounter them with these other videos on YouTube, you'll be able to recognize that these are mistaken readings of Nietzsche. So here we go. The statements of Amor Fati. The statement comes from Die Frohliche Wissenschaft, or The Joyful Quest. Amor Fati is a longer statement, and this is the way that it is prefaced. This is my translation. I've cleaned this up a little bit. I've also made its criticism of Descartes more explicit. So, to the new year, the idea being that this is being written on New Year's Day. So, to the new year, I am, therefore I think. If I continue to live, then I will continue to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. So today, everyone allows the speaking out of wishful and heartfelt thinking. So now I also want to say what I wish for myself today, and which thought first ran across my heart this year, which thought shall be my foundation, certainty, and sweetness for the rest of my life. So this is a kind of preface to the actual statement of Amor Fati. So then here's the statement. I want to learn more and more to see the necessary in things as beautiful. Then I will be one who makes things beautiful. Amor Fati shall be my love from now on. I do not want to wage war on what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Looking away will be my only negation, and all in all and on the whole, I wish to be only a yes-sayer. All right, let's talk about this for a moment. First off, I was at a bookstore recently. I opened up a book on cynicism, and it started by saying, we like the no-sayers better than the yes-sayers. And I thought, that's lovely. Nietzsche is not suggesting that there is no negation, right? He even gives his method for negation here. Nietzsche is not suggesting that everything will be somehow pleasurable, or everything will be something that you love, right? It's not the content, it's the relation. It's not the content, it's the relation. So I think that this is the one way in which, Nietzsche's philosophy is very special in the sense that if you look at the Socratic schools, and there'll be an episode on this later on, but if you look at the Socratic schools, this sense in which the skeptics and the Stoics and the Cynics and the hedonists or the Epicureans and the Cyrenaic schools, if you look at them as criticizing one another and in a kind of philosophical battle with one another, there is a sense in which it appears almost as if all of the possible positions are exhausted. However, it seems to me that Nietzsche does provide another position. And so what I mean by that is that Nietzsche is neither advocating for Stoicism, nor is he advocating for cynicism. And I don't think that he's advocating for skepticism either. Rather, what I see him saying, what I hear him saying, is that it's not about the content. If the content is determined by divine forces, right? Whatever comes next in your life, whatever the future holds for you, it's not something that you have complete control over, right? It's not something that you can completely determine. When we experience whatever is coming toward us in the future, when we experience this, Amor Fati is not about the content of that experience. Amor Fati is about the relation to the content of that experience. And sometimes the content is going to be tragic. Sometimes it's going to be things that we really dislike. Okay, so having said that, then look at the highlighted pieces. Nietzsche wants to see the necessary in things as beautiful. So there is some sense here in which this even invokes a kind of aesthetic idea of beauty, and this notion that there will be some things that are unnecessary, but when we experience what is necessary, we want to be able to see that as beautiful. When we're able to see what is necessary as beautiful, then we will be one who is creating, right? We will be one who is making these things beautiful. I think that in and of itself reveals that Nietzsche is not being a fully deterministic philosopher here, right? This is not about determinism, that there is some room, there is some space for us to create and to create meaning, to make meaning out of the experiences in our life. And even if these experiences are tragic, and even if these experiences are actually unpleasurable, not only will we say yes to what is necessary, but we will not attempt to negate it or run from it, that we will love it as necessary. And by being able to see this necessary as beautiful, by being able to see it as involving divinity, I think that this is the secret to making the connection between necessity as fate. Necessity is always understood as fate in philosophy when you're doing continental philosophy and looking at figures from Plato to Nietzsche, for example. But not only then does it make the connection between fate and beauty, but also this sense in which it connects back up with the eternal return and this divine being that is revealing the sense in which the life that you're experiencing, you're going to have to experience it over and over again. Hopefully that is a good way to get us through the essential statement of Amor Fati in Nietzsche's philosophy. Okay, this is a passage from Twilight of the Idols, and it's the passage from the Twilight of the Idols where Nietzsche also states Amor Fati. So the Twilight of the Idols comes later than the Joyful Quest. I include these here so that we can clarify. Most people only look at the passage from the Joyful Quest. By looking at these other passages, it's able to help us clarify what's going on with the essential statement of Amor Fati in the Joyful Quest. Saying yes to life, even in its strangest and hardest problems, the will to life, rejoicing over its own inexhaustibility, even in the very sacrifice of its highest types. That is what I called Dionysian. That is what I understood as the bridge to the psychology of the tragic poet. Not in order to get rid of terror and pity, not in order to purge oneself of a dangerous affect by its vehement discharge. Aristotle misunderstood it that way. But in order to be oneself, the eternal joy of becoming. So in order to be oneself, the eternal joy of becoming, beyond all terror and pity, that joy which includes even joy in destroying. If we are involved in the eternal becoming, right, this eternal return, this constant creation and destruction of ourselves, then there is some sense for Nietzsche that not only, as he mentions here, is this divine and Dionysian, but also there is some sense in which it is necessary. So by being able to see that necessary, being able to see the creation and the tragedy and the destruction as beautiful, is the ability to make it beautiful. It is the ability to resonate and participate in this Dionysian power. It is the ability to manifest the Dionysian worldview. I think that we need this passage in order to help us understand Amor Fati. Let's keep going. Okay, so this is Nietzsche's statement of Amor Fati from Ecce Homo. Notice here he says, "My formula for greatness is Amor Fati, that you do not want anything to be different. You do not want anything to be different. Not forwards, not backwards, not for all eternity. Not just to tolerate necessity, still less to conceal it, but rather to love it," right? To love necessity. So this helps us link up necessity and the love of fate and the making of things beautiful that are necessary. All right. This is one of the Philosophemes. This is from The Will to Power. Here Nietzsche says, "The highest state that a philosopher can attain, and that is to stand in a Dionysian relationship to existence." Notice if you recall this from the previous slide, this Dionysian relationship to existence is to participate in that creation and destruction, to stand in a Dionysian relationship to existence. My formula for this is Amor Fati. So again, I hope you're seeing that these passages from Nietzsche that we're looking at are absolutely solidifying this reading of Amor Fati that I'm providing for you here. If we think of Amor Fati as soteriological, what does this mean? I mentioned this already at the beginning, but Amor Fati as soteriological means the position of Amor Fati in relation to existence results from self-actualization. It also means being able to take the transcendental dimension as a point of view regarding existence. And then lastly, it means accomplishing an understanding of life such that one can say yes to life and experience all of life, even the tragic, as joyful. How can you experience the tragic as joyful? I believe that Nietzsche's answer for this is not just seeing it as necessary, but as seeing it as divine affectivity. So it is Dionysian activity. It is the Dionysian destruction of your existence. It is the Dionysian destruction of this aspect of your life. And so therefore, by being able to witness these experiences in these ways, it's not simply that you're seeing it as necessary and then you're able to say, oh, well, it's fate and I'm supposed to love fate. And so therefore, I'm not bothered by this tragedy. I don't think that that's what we're talking about here. I think rather that it's horrible, right? It's sometimes horrific. Sometimes, you're laying on the floor, wondering how you're going to make it into the rest of your life, wondering if maybe you shouldn't go into the rest of your life. So wondering if, there's some way that you can end the pain and the suffering. So I think that in that way, you're fully experiencing the tragedy. And how can you possibly say yes to that, right? You can say yes to it in a number of ways, but all of them link back to this idea that what you are experiencing is necessary, what you are experiencing is beautiful, and what you are experiencing is divine affectivity. That the gods, or that God, or that Dionysus, from whatever point of view you want to take in regard to theology here, that the gods are reaching in and destroying these aspects of your life, and that as the gods are reaching in and destroying these aspects of your life, it is possible for you to witness the activity of the gods, right? It is possible for you to resonate with the presence of the gods in relation to your own existence. And in doing this, it is possible for you to participate in the gods' participation in your life. I think this is Amor Fati, right? There's a divine depth that many of the people who discuss Amor Fati miss. Just to round this out, then, should have 4 more slides. So Amor Fati as the second part of a 2-part idea. We talked about this. I mentioned this in the episode 7 on the eternal return, but just to mention it here. The eternal return, we suggested that it could be understood as a cosmological idea in the sense that it is a characterization of nature. That is the idea of eternal becoming. And that, of course, involves constant creation and destruction. But also it can be understood as an existential test or as a selective principle. And we discussed that at the beginning of this. And so then therefore, because there is room for you to change your relation to your experience of your life, it is possible to ascend to this point of self-actualization or apotheosis from which your attitude to the constant creation and destruction of your life and your attitude to the eternal return of your existence is one of Amor Fati, one of saying yes, one of making things beautiful, one of participating in the participation of the gods in your life. So just a quick comment then in regard to the influence of Nietzsche here, because everyone wants to talk about the Stoics, but
This is Mark.
And this is Wes.
We'd like to tell you about Close Reads,
A philosophy podcast where we comment on philosophy texts in real time.
We give you the experience of reading very difficult verbiage without you having to actually do that.
We cover the big names and the figures you've always wanted to know more about.
And share our insights from 15 years running the Partially Examined Life podcast, downloaded over 50 million times.
Join us
on Close Reads.
I think there's a much closer influence on Nietzsche here. So a couple quick ideas. I realize that Nietzsche makes critical comments about Kant, and I've talked about this in Nietzsche's Canon, the episode on Nietzsche's Canon as well. But we absolutely must realize that, just as we had said, for example, when we started looking at the architectonic of philosophy in general, and we said 2 people could be doing philosophy in the sense that, maybe one's a theist and one's an atheist. And so here are 2 people who radically disagree with each other, and yet from the point of view of what question they're addressing, or from the point of view of what branch of philosophy they're doing philosophy in, they are the same. And it's important to recognize that they are the same, because then it allows us to locate them in that fractal structure view, for example, of the history of philosophy. So if you're looking at it that way, then we could say something like this. We could say that Nietzsche is absolutely working in Kant's wake, that Nietzsche is absolutely working post the Kantian Copernican revolution in the history of Western philosophy. And Nietzsche is not a fool, right? And so the idea being is that all of these philosophers, and especially these Germans, right, these German philosophers that come after Kant, every single one of them are singing Kant's praises. Every single one of them is attempting to somehow improve upon Kant's philosophy, if that's possible, or to employ Kant's philosophy in a way that has not yet been accomplished. Yet at the same time, though, everyone recognizes the greatness of Kant. And I understand that professors in America and in universities in America, especially instructors with, people with merely with master's degrees in philosophy, the tendency is in America to think, and this is absolutely because of Bertrand Russell and his book, The History of Western Philosophy. And Bertrand Russell was just upset with Germans in general. But it is absolutely the case that the majority of professors and instructors in America just want to suggest that Kant was some kind of an idiot, right? That Kant was some kind of a fool. how could he possibly have thought the things that he thought, and he's not worth reading, right? That's the way they want you to relate to Kant and his philosophy. That had been my experience all the way up into my PhD work. And then suddenly I'm like, you know what? I don't believe this anymore, right? And not only that, but I would rather listen to the opinion of philosophers like Schelling and Hegel and Fichte and Schopenhauer and Hölderlin and Novalis and Kierkegaard. And Nietzsche even, but I would rather listen to the opinions of those philosophers than of, some guy in America who doesn't understand Kant. Kant is definitely an influence. Then we have Schelling on the left here, upper left. Schelling, of course, was giving his Berlin lectures, and the Berlin lectures are permeated with Dionysus and his comments on Dionysus. Schelling and his Berlin lectures were absolutely a triumph over Hegel, despite the fact that there's a sense in which it didn't really catch on. But if you read those lectures, there is a clear sense in which he points out that Hegel's philosophy is a negative philosophy and that his philosophy is a positive philosophy. This positive philosophy becomes existentialism. And it is a development of transcendental philosophy out of Kant, right? So the point just being is that Schelling is an influence. He's in the background. Schelling is emphasizing Dionysus, and he is emphasizing Dionysus internal to transcendental philosophy. Schopenhauer, over on the far right here above Nietzsche, Schopenhauer was a major, major influence on Nietzsche. According to Nietzsche, there are places in which he suggests that if there really is one person that you could learn philosophy from, you should go learn philosophy from Schopenhauer. So major, major influence there. Schopenhauer's philosophy of life, again, is the early transition or bridge from Kant's transcendental philosophy into existential philosophy. And Schopenhauer is understood as a radical pessimist. What Nietzsche took from, so if Nietzsche gets this idea of Dionysus and positive philosophy from Schelling from Kant through Schelling, what he gets from Schopenhauer is this idea that, okay, let's maybe say that everything is absolutely horrible. Let's take this pessimistic point of view. If everything is horrible, and I'm essentially verbatim quoting Nietzsche here, how well disposed would you need to be, right? How would you need to change yourself, or what would you need to be in yourself in order to relate to all of this horrible existence and to still see it as beautiful, to still see it as joyful, right? And to say yes to it. And so there is a sense in which this almost worst case scenario is coming out of Schopenhauer. And whereas Schopenhauer is sort of relating to it in a sort of muscular way, Nietzsche is, in a sense, showing us the divinity, the divine piece to it. And then Kierkegaard here, we talked about this in the Eternal Return episode, but it is absolutely clear that Nietzsche was aware of Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's work, and also he was aware specifically of Kierkegaard's idea of repetition. So really, in the literature, this is referred to as Nietzsche's eureka moment whenever he discovers the concept of repetition in Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, of course, was attending Schelling's Berlin lectures. So Kierkegaard is absolutely influenced by Schelling. And Kierkegaard is explicit. Kierkegaard says that his favorite philosopher is Kant. So you can see this sort of web of influence here suddenly emerging. And again, Nietzsche's Eternal Return may be understood as a combination or a kind of creation out of this web of influence, and then Amor Fati as this sort of crowning jewel in relation to the Eternal Return that he developed out of these influences. So I think that that's helpful, and I think that it's important to recognize this. Okay, so lastly then, this passage from The Will to Power, and I've mentioned this already in this episode, but I just want to make it explicit again. I'm starting to think that instead of saying the will to power, we really should be saying the will to create or the will to actualize. I like the idea of the will to power as a translation, Wille zur Macht. And the Macht here, there's lots of literature on this, but the Macht here can refer to creation, a making, but also if you use the word actualize, it helps you link up with the history of philosophy. So I like this idea of the will to power. as a translation of Wille zur Macht. However, will to create and will to actualize, we also want to keep those in mind as ways to translate this that are there as we're saying the will to power, or they should be there. Lastly, then, let's look at this passage 1041 from the Will to Power. My new path to a yes. I'm quoting Nietzsche here. Philosophy, as I have hitherto understood and lived it, is a voluntary quest for even the most detested and notorious sides of existence. From the long experience I gained from such a wandering through ice and wilderness, I learned to view differently all that had hitherto philosophized. The hidden history of philosophy, the psychology of its great names, came to light for me. How much truth can a spirit endure? How much truth does a spirit dare? This became for me the real standard of value. Error is cowardice. Every achievement of knowledge is a consequence of courage, of severity toward oneself, of cleanliness toward oneself. Such an experimental philosophy as I live anticipates experimentally even the possibilities of the most fundamental nihilism. But this does not mean that it must halt at a negation, a no, a will to negation. It wants rather to cross over to the opposite of this, to a Dionysian affirmation of the world as it is, without subtraction, exception, or selection. It wants the eternal circulation, the same things, the same logic and illogic of entanglements. The highest state a philosopher can attain to stand in a Dionysian relationship to existence. My formula for this is Amor Fati. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino, and I'll see you in the future.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.